Congressman Collins, before we get to the question of whether this is an impeachable offense or not, simply, do you see anything wrong with that? The president conditioning support for Ukraine, whether it was a meeting, whether with Zelensky, whether it's military, conditioning support for Ukraine to that country investigating some of the president's political rivals?
Well, I think it's interesting that the premise of your question is based on witnesses who agree with your premise. I disagree and say that Mr. Volker, Mr. Morrison, even Mr. Sondland, who presumed it was being conditioned, the president himself told Senator Johnson there was no precondition. There was nothing to be presumed on this. So if you want to show one side, then also show the other side as we go along with this. President Trump has always been concerned about foreign aid. He's always been concerned about what's going on in the Ukraine and Europe, and how is Europe participating, and how our tax dollars. The question is, though, if we're looking at corruption, does it matter who's involved? That's the problem in the policy issue that got discussed in Intel. He was looking at the corruption part of this, and yes, if the Bidens were involved, then they would have been a part of that. But the problem is there's never a discussion in Intel that we saw, as I just pointed out, several key fact witnesses who actually said there was no conditioning on this. So you can put reporters up or not. But
let me ask you, if I might, sir, because we're about to run out of time. July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky. He never mentions corruption in Ukraine. He never mentions Burisma. He just mentions investigate 2 Americans, and he names them, Joe Biden and his son Hunter.
Okay. Again, if you look at the call itself, there was an overall discussion which had been had previously by others in discussion with Ukraine. And also just go back to the fact of the president looks after our tax dollars, and the president's looking out for the fact, was there problems there? When we look at this process, we do not see a president who conditioned anything. He just wanted the facts, whether it be 2016 election, whether we were looking at of what was happening. He was looking at the fact of, is there corruption? So I do not spend dollars that I don't need to spend in the Ukraine because of corruption that was still there. Okay, this is an issue.
Let me just ask you a thought experiment. Just bear with me for a minute. Okay. If you believed that the president had used the power of his office to try to get Ukraine to interfere with our elections, if you believe that, would that be an impeachable offense?
I do not believe it, so that I'm not going to answer a hypothetical in which is designed to simply say that the president did something improper. Chris, he did nothing improper. There was nothing about a problematic giving aid to another country in which you're talking about corruption, which he's required to do by law. And it just so happened that a presidential candidate's son, who was getting a massive amount of money from a company that had been under investigation, in which even other witnesses that have been favorable, quote, to the Democrats in the investigation, have said needed to be looked at. This is a problem of overall proportion, but there's nothing here that the president did wrong. And this is the thing that we're going to move forward on.
This is Georgia Republican Doug Collins getting called out by Chris Wallace for his blatantly problematic defenses of Trump. When Wallace points out that a slew of witnesses, including Volker and Morrison and Sondland, have testified that Trump conditioned aid to Ukraine on a probe into Joe Biden, Collins condescends that it's, quote, interesting that the premise of your question is based on witnesses who agree with your premise. Only Collins' argument is just a tad flawed, considering every witness agreed with that premise because it is the truth. Trump conditioned aid on the announcement of an investigation into Joe Biden. Gordon Sondland, who had a first-hand account, a conversation with Donald Trump himself, testified under oath that Trump wouldn't release the aid until the sham investigation pursued by Rudy Giuliani was agreed to.
Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, and I worked with Mr. Rudy Giuliani on Ukraine matters at the express direction of the President of the United States. We did not want to work with Mr. Giuliani. Simply put, we were playing the hand we were dealt. We all understood that if we refused to work with Mr. Giuliani, we would lose a very important opportunity to cement relations between the United States and Ukraine. So we followed the President's orders.
And not only that, he also testified that Trump didn't even care about rooting out corruption with any sort of investigation, that it was simply the announcement of the investigation into Biden that he was looking for.
But he had to get those 2 investigations if that official act was going to take place, correct?
He had to announce the investigations. He didn't actually have to do them, as I understood it.
So when Collins complains that the witnesses all agreed with the premise that Trump conditioned support for Ukraine on a probe into his political opponent, that's like complaining that those witnesses all agreed with the premise that fire is hot and water is wet and Roy Moore shouldn't be allowed near malls and movie theaters. You can be against premises based on facts, but that doesn't make them any less factual. And as if that wasn't bad enough, Collins' principal defense here is that Trump told Senator Johnson that there was no precondition, so it must not be true. So I guess that's it. Nothing to see here, since the guy accused of the crime says he didn't do it. Man, anyone who commits a crime in Georgia better hope that Doug Collins is on the jury at your trial. Collins then repeats the baseless talking point that Trump has always been concerned with the issue of foreign aid in Ukraine and whether Europe was participating enough. So let's take a look at international aid to Ukraine with the latest figures available. The EU gave more than double what the United States gave to Ukraine. I found that out in a minute on Google. Presumably, the President of the United States also has Google, but at the very least, I would hope he has access to these same numbers. So if his entire rationale for withholding aid was that he was unhappy that Europe wasn't giving enough aid to Ukraine, then I'm not entirely sure he's able to read very basic charts. But what was especially striking, that neither Collins nor any of Trump's mouthpieces seem able to directly answer, is that despite corruption being the supposed reason for Trump withholding the aid, it curiously never managed to come up in the phone call. You would think that if the issue of corruption was as important as all of Trump's defenders say it is, that Trump might think to, bring it up just once. But, and this is as clear as day for anyone not blinded by loyalty to Donald Trump, this was never about corruption. It was only about hurting Joe Biden politically. That's why he didn't bother to utter the word corruption even once in his call to Zelensky. That's why he used Giuliani as a shadow State Department instead of using the actual State Department. That's why Sondland and the rest of the US delegation negotiating with Ukraine admitted under oath that they all realized, believed, and acknowledged that the announcement of the probe into Biden was a condition for any and all diplomatic relations between our two countries. It's why Sondland also admitted under oath that it wasn't even about the investigation itself, but just the announcement of the probe. And yet the fact that Trump himself refuses to testify, refuses to go under oath to refute any of this, tells you everything you need to know about who's telling the truth and who isn't. And the most telling part of all of this is that Doug Collins won't even answer the hypothetical of whether or not it would be impeachable if the president committed an extortion scheme for help in the next election. And that's because of course he knows Trump did it, of course it's impeachable, and of course he doesn't want to be on record saying anything that could come back to haunt him, because it probably will. So it should come as no surprise that Collins spews out some nonsensical word salad before desperately pivoting to Hunter Biden.
Chris, he did nothing improper. There was nothing about a problematic giving aid to another country in which you're talking about corruption, which he's required to do by law. And it just so happened that a presidential candidate's son, who was getting a massive amount of money from a company that had been under investigation, in which even other witnesses that have been favorable, quote, to the Democrats in the investigation, have said needed to be looked at.
Because the alternative would be to actually confront the fact that Trump extorted Ukraine for some personal help in the next election. And as much as Republicans don't want to admit it, this is as impeachable an offense as we've ever seen in American history.